Okay. My name is Christian Lefers. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research and the University of British Columbia. And I'm chairing the session together with my colleagues Graesser, a research officer at the University of Queensland, Vincent Ricciardi, a doctoral researcher at the University of British Columbia, and Navin Ramankutty, professor at the University of British Columbia. It is also a great pleasure to welcome Hannah Whitman, professor at the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at the University of British Columbia, who will be our discussant for today. So you will see the session, it has a little bit of a different structure. We will hear all 4 or 5 talks consecutively and then come together to have a joint Q&A at the end of the session. So why did we decide to have a session on farm size and food security, sustainability, and social justice? So we know that farm size is assumed to be linked to environmental, economic, and human well-being, though the spatial patterns, driving forces, and social and environmental characteristics remain weakly understood. So questions such as how much food do farms of varying size actually produce in different regions of the world? It's largely unclear. What is the management intensity of farms of varying sizes? And how does farm size relate to socio-environmental trade-offs? The first presenter will be Vincent Ricciardi, and he will present on smaller farms are consistently higher yielding and biodiverse than large farms, a meta-analysis, so partly answering one of the questions I was just posing. Followed by Maurice Tschopp, who will be talking about land tenure, insecurity, and investment in sustainable agricultural practices by small-scale farmers in the Chaco Salteño. Followed by Forrest R, who will be talking about measuring household food security and variability and land functions across communities in a semi-arid savanna system. Maarten J will talk about understanding agricultural extensification, assessing the effect of external drivers and trade-offs, and tipping points in intensive and extensive agriculture. And our last presenter, I don't know if Sarat Prasad is here. No. But if he comes, he will talk about relationship between land and labor for sustainable development in India, and that will be a flash talk. The first 4 talks will be full presentations, and then, as I said, Hannah Whitman will lead the discussion at the end of the session. The full talks will be about 12 minutes, flash talks 3 minutes. There will be only 1 or 2 questions of understanding after each talk, to allow the joint Q&A session of about 50 minutes in the end with our discussion. So to all presenters, please stay in time. And with that, let's enjoy the session. And Vincent Ricciardi, please come to the front.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to the last session. My name is Vincent Ricciardi at the University of British Columbia. And I wanted to talk to you today about the role of small-scale farms in the global food system. And as Christian said, I'm going to be highlighting a meta-analysis, but I also wanted to highlight a data set we created that's harmonized data to answer some of these questions. So first, a little bit of motivation. As some of you might know, there's a big farm size transition that's been happening. Farms are getting larger and more industrialized as countries economically develop, and smaller and more fragmented elsewhere. And there's these push and pull factors to why this is happening. The pull factors, they're pulling farmers off the land because of job opportunities with economic development. And then there's these push factors because of land consolidation policies, historical legacies, or large-scale land acquisition. And these different push and pull factors are the backdrop of a lot of the unequal development that's going on, where smaller farms have more unequal access to technology or unequal access to markets. And these stressors on small farms, they've motivated a lot of recent international policy calls. A lot of you know the SDGs, SDG 2, Zero Hunger. A key target is by 2030 to double the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. But in my mind, advocates and decision makers need better information to achieve this target. So just to give you an example, there's a lot of zombie statistics at the global level floating around, right? And in one form or another, this one in green has been floating around for the last 10 years, where 70% of the world's food comes from small farms under 2 hectares in size. But at the same time, from the World Census of Agriculture, which we can maybe trust a little bit more, it says 12% of all the farm area in the world is farmed by these really small farms. So there's a mismatch, and we need better statistics for to help monitor these international efforts designed to help these small-scale farmers. So I wanted to present 2 quick studies, kind of overviews, and we can dive in later, that we've been doing. So first is how much food do small-scale farmers produce at the global scale? Our team compiled a data set of national sample surveys and agricultural censuses, and we harmonized them across 55 countries. Altogether, it's over 150 crop species in here, and it represents about half of all the agricultural production in the world. In terms of methods, we had 2 basic methods. One was accounting, so what farm size grows the most crop for food, feed, processed goods, or is wasted. And the second question was on crop diversity. So in the same landscape, what size farms grow the greatest diversity of crops? Our results show 2 main findings. First, farms under 2 hectares produce 30 to 35% of the world's food. And a huge caveat here is our surveys didn't include China, so we tried to bootstrap our results to extrapolate our confidence intervals to the global level. And our results are actually in line with 2 recent studies that used global data sets, crop data sets and farm size data sets overlaid, and they came up with really similar results, also including livestock and fisheries. So I'm pretty confident that this is much closer to the actual number. The second main result is in this chart, and it shows the percent species richness, so the amount of unique crop species in a given landscape compared to different farm sizes in that landscape. And it shows that smaller farms grow a lot more different types of crops than larger farms. So from these results, we see a lot of support for small-scale farms. They grow a decent amount of the world's food, 30% is a lot, and they have more crop diversity. But then I started reading a lot of policy documents about small-scale farms, about large farms, and you see a lot of these different rationales for countries wanting land consolidation policies instead of promoting small-scale farms. And a lot of the rhetoric is around that larger farms are more productive and more efficient. So that led us to the second study, which was a meta-analysis, where we looked at the relationships between farm size and different socio-ecological outcomes. And so what we did is we looked at the literature and asked 5 hypotheses. We looked at the relationship between farm size and yields, and non-crop biodiversity, resource use efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, and profit per hectare. And we queried Web of Science and Scopus. We found 1,500 studies, narrowed it down to 120 through different exclusion criteria. And from that, we extracted 300 plus observations. So a study might have multiple observations if it reported multiple crops or locations or years. And because of the nature of some of the different data that we were extracting here, we used different types of methods. So first, we used a vote count, where we binned all the different studies into 3 categories. Did they find a negative relationship between, say, yield or biodiversity and farm size, a null relationship, or a positive relationship? And then through using some ordinal mixed models, where we had our random effects as location and crop type, we tried to figure out the probability that studies found a negative, null, or positive relationship with farm size. Our second method for this was to figure out the effect size. And from that, we found studies that regressed farm size onto our outcome variables. So does farm size explain yield? And we extracted those regression slopes and standard errors. And what we wanted to know was, per 1 hectare change in farm size, what was the equivalent percentage change in yield or resource use efficiency or profit or greenhouse gas emissions? And we constructed some hierarchical meta regressions using location and crop type as random effects again to try to figure this out. So in terms of our first results, this chart shows the probability of a study finding a negative, null, or positive relationship with yields. And we can see that there's a really high probability that studies found that smaller farms had higher yields. And we also did this for the other ones as well. We didn't find any significant relationship between farm size and resource use efficiency or profit per hectare, but the biodiversity one really shot up there, where smaller farms at the field and the landscape level, across a wide variety of diversity metrics, which we did sensitivity analyses on, showed that smaller farms promoted a lot more biodiversity, non-crop biodiversity, across a wide variety of non-crop species. And again, those are the yield relationships, and the biodiversity one showed that smaller farms were a lot better. With the effect size estimates, we couldn't do it for biodiversity, but we could do it for greenhouse gas emissions and the other variables of interest. And we found really similar results. So there was that relationship with smaller farms had higher yields. And we actually estimated that for every 1 hectare change in farm size, there was an equivalent around 5% decrease in yields. A big caveat of that is a lot of the literature only looks at a pretty narrow range of farm sizes, maybe up to like 20 hectares. So if we're thinking about more precision agriculture, really large scale, this probably will flip, but the literature just doesn't have that. We also found a slightly negative trend for the greenhouse gas emissions at the per crop level, but it wasn't significant. So the main takeaways from this are that smaller farms promote more biodiversity and that smaller farms had higher yields. But as we were thinking about this, just because a small farm has maybe, say, 5% more yields, or maybe even more, it doesn't mean that those yields might be enough to lift their incomes out of poverty. And so for that last part of the question, we're undergoing an analysis on this one data set that I found that the UN's FAO is just finishing, and it's called RULIS, the Rural Livelihood Information System. It's this tremendous effort where they've harmonized around 37 different countries' worth of national sample surveys, and it represents around 3 million farmers on 60,000 farms. It has like over 200 variables. It's really this wild data set that's amazing. And just at a basic look, we looked at that profit per hectare relationship and farm size, and we found this. So we found that as farm size increases, their profit per hectare decreases, just like the yield. It's probably because of the higher yields. But then we flip this around into a poverty context. And so instead of dividing profit by the land area, we divided profit by the amount of people living in an agricultural household. And we found the exact opposite. So what that means is, yes, they're more productive, but they're a lot poorer too. And so I just want to put that yield result into context with this. So I hope that that presentation kind of gives you a brief overview of the role of small farms in the global food system before we dive into these other case studies today. And I just wanted to thank all of my awesome collaborators. A lot of them are sitting right here. UBC and SHRC Canada for funding, and the FAO for being really generous with their data set. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinny. Probably for those who have not found and want to sit, that might be a good time to start a free seat.
Yeah.
Any questions of understanding for Vinny?
Yeah, so just in case that side didn't hear, he was wondering about how we actually measured crop diversity in farm size. And it's a great question. Maybe I glossed over. We were looking at the amount of crop species, the unique crop species that different sizes of farms had given the same landscape. So like of all the crop species grown in one landscape, how many crop species did each farm size actually grow? And we did that through all the subnational regions that we had in our data set, and we found a really consistent relationship that smaller farms grew a larger percent of different crop species than other farms.
Yeah. One question of understanding. Move on, because we have for those who all right, next speaker is Maurice Tschopp.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm very happy to be presenting here. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm quite impressed by the number of people in the room. I thought more people would be leaving already, but yeah, that's a good thing. I'm going to present you some very specific results of a current investigation. We did a survey last year with small-scale producers in Argentina, and it's really a work in progress. So I'm going to present some very preliminary results of this work. I'm going to focus mostly on the adoption of sustainable practices and see the contribution of land size, land tenure, and other socioeconomic factors in these adoption patterns. I want to thank also already all my co-authors and the persons who contributed to this work, especially Graziano Cedia and Carla Guaggiato that are here today, and also Nick Bardsley and Hernan Hernandez from INTA Argentina. Okay, so our research context is the Chaco Salteño. I'm sure many of you might be familiar with the Gran Chaco ecoregion, which has the highest forest cover areas after the Amazon in Latin America. And this region has experienced very high deforestation rates in the last decades, resulting from pressure from an agro-industrial sector and the development, the expansion of soil cultivates, for instance, soil cultivations. And if we zoom in the province of Salta, which is a case study, and in the north more specifically, we can really see this advance of the agricultural frontier, and basically the pink, dark pink and the red areas are areas that were deforested in the last 10, 15 years. And we can really see this advance developing from the main road axis. But today I'm not going to focus mostly on the deforestation topic, but more on the forests that are currently remaining and on the main forest users that depend on these spaces for their livelihoods. So we can very conceptually distinguish between three different groups of forest users. Of course, there are first the large-scale landowners who contributed recently in deforestation, especially for crop production such as soy, but also for livestock production. But we also have like indigenous people with different indigenous communities kind of dispersed in the whole Chaco Salteño region, who rely mostly on different activities, including hunting and gathering, production of small livestock for their livelihoods. And we have small-scale criollo farmers who claim to be kind of descendants of Spanish colonizers and whose main livelihood depend on cattle production in a very extensive systems. So the traditional management practices of this group, it includes campo abierto, open field management, which means that the cattle, the animals are left to roam within the forest and to feed from the different trees and bushes. So it's a silvopastoral system that involves very little management. It's also a system that requires a lot of space. Up to 20 to 30 hectares per cattle held are needed. It's dry forest, so of course that's also explained this. And it's different practices that can affect on the long-term landscape composition and result in land degradation. The main reason being that cattle feeding will favor some species to the detriment of others. So for instance, you have an abundance of this kind of thorny bushes encroachments in the Chaco ecosystem, which is also partly a result of the species not really being consumed by cows. And there are some alternatives that are being introduced currently in the whole Chaco region for these smallholders. The first practice that we consider here is having different types of barriers and enclosed space within your land to permit, to allow for some limitation in the movement of animals, some rotational grazing as well. Some producers also introduce exotic grassland species, especially gatton panics and buffalo grasses. And so these grass species aim to provide food for the animals during the dry season mostly. Oftentimes, together with the introduction of these grass species, we have selective clearing of woody encroachments to kind of leave some space for the grass to develop. And we also have some introduction of new cattle breeds, such as the Angus breed, who also have the potential to reduce the pressure during the dry season. And in this context, our main research question is to see what drives the adoption of these different practices, what is the role of land tenure and land size in the adoption of these practices, and also what is the contribution of producer organizations, so social capital, if you will. Our methods, so first we did some explorative and semi-directive interviews last year, which resulted in the development of a survey that was conducted in autumn 2018. We worked together with different producer associations to kind of access this field, and we interviewed 550 households. And here I'm going to present some very preliminary results using simple logic models. I'm going to discuss a little bit how we want to push these models further. So the results, if we look at the barriers and rotational grazing that is taking place in the region, we see that we have significant results for different socioeconomic factors. We see also that the higher households that have almost all of their income coming from agriculture are more likely to adopt these practices as well. For selective breeding, we have very interesting results showing, for instance, that literacy plays an important role, as well as other factors, land size as well, meaning that the larger the land, the more likely a producer is going to adopt such practices. And also, like having a higher portion of your income depending on agriculture is a good predictor of this, of the adoption of this practice. If we look at the introduction of silvopastoral zones, here we see that, again, having a high proportion of income plays a huge role, and land size as well. Land tenure security contributes a little bit to this, but it's under the 10% threshold, so it's not really considered, but I'm going to come back on this specific issue later. And finally, selective clearing to remove shrubs and bushes. This practice is also adopted by people that are almost exclusively farmers. And we see also an influence of farm employment on this. So to summarize, to put everything together, so we see that the proportion of income dedicated to agriculture seems to play an important role in every variable that is considered in the model. And we also see that other variables as land size and land tenure to some extent affect only some of these practices, mainly the genetic improvements, so introduction of new breeds, and also the introduction of silvopastoral zones. Whereas we see also that other control variables that we included in the model kind of influence all the adoption of these practices. Cool. So, to come back to this question of land size and how it drives, first we have to say it was very challenging to measure in this specific context. First, there was an important defiance, some problems of many producers who didn't want to share this information with us. So in the whole survey, it's the variable that we have with the more NAs. And first, the reason might be people are afraid to give this data because they don't want, many of them are squatting privately owned land by an absentee landowner, and they don't want to be, at some point, this data to be used against them. For instance, if they would say that they use, 400 hectares, that at some point this data would come back and limit them in their management. Also, another reason to explain why so many people were reluctant to share this data with us, it's especially with these open field managements. Some of them just don't really know or give you a very broad estimate of the data, of the land size that they use. And finally, also, one of the big issues that we have is the land is oftentimes shared between different families, especially in this open field management. So it's very, sometimes it's reflected in the answer of people and sometimes not. And finally, the question of land tenure, it's not as important as hypothesized, but there is a very important thing to consider here. I present merged results from different municipalities. And I was very interested into digging a bit deeper into this land tenure question. And by subsetting by the different municipalities who have very different conditions, we see that we get positive results. And actually, the directionality of the influence of land tenure is different in different municipalities. And why is that? It's mostly because in some areas that are characterized by a high level of conflicts, it seems that people who do not have any claim on land would tend to invest more in such practices, like in improvements such as having barriers or having silvopastoral, because that's also something that they can use further down the road for a claim on this land piece. So that's you have actually the land tenure hypothesis that we typically have, that when you are the owner of the land, you're more likely to invest in it. It doesn't necessarily hold in all the specific contexts. The next step that we're going to work on in this project, so again, very preliminary results here. So we want to apply different types of models, including order, regressions, hierarchical models, because there is a strong interrelation between all these practices that we have shown before. Something innovative also in our survey is that we try to include social network metrics in the models. So further down the road, the idea would be to kind of integrate these social networks and see how they influence the adoption of these practices. And finally, we had a lot of geodata as well, and the idea would be to be able to visualize the patterns of adoptions on maps. Okay, so to conclude, we see that land tenure and land size play a role in the adoption of these practices, but maybe not as much as it could be expected, and that has a lot to do with the very specific context of our research of a very extensive cattle ranching system. And of course, there is some importance of classical social capital and socio-economic factors that influence the adoption of these practices. Also, something that I wanted to address is that we hope that these results can feed into the current policy discussion that they have in Argentina, and especially some public policies that are being developed for forest areas, namely the MEBGI, which aims to improve sustainable management of this forest by smallholder and indigenous communities. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Again, one question of understanding.
Yeah? Okay, yeah.
And whether you are making it a difference, you analyze them, you show the results for all of them together, or for me, what's important to see which actors belong to which one?
No, yeah, it was. We took the decision quite early to focus only on these Criollo smallholder groups. So it's not. It doesn't include indigenous communities or large-scale landowners. And actually, next year the idea would be to focus more on the large-scale landowners, but with different methods like more semi-directive interviews and etc.
Thank you.
I don't know if you. Oh.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Christian and the organizers for inviting us to present in this session. It's great to see such an interested group in this particular topic, even though I think we're fitting, trying to address this from a slightly different angle. So I'm here to representing a relatively large group of people working on an NSF-funded project looking at food security and household vulnerability with respect to food security in semi-arid savanna region in southern Africa. We sort of span a set of institutions that represent a core group of people that have been working in this particular region for quite some time, albeit in various capacities. And a few of them are here today with me, and we're extremely happy to present the first set of these results that are coming out of this project. The overarching research objective is really to look at and try to better understand how livelihoods and land use and the intersection of land use and the outcomes of that land use fit together with respect to households and their vulnerability to changing environmental conditions in a trans-frontier conservation area in southern Africa. The study area that we're dealing with specifically is the CASA, Trans-Frontier Conservation Area. It's the largest terrestrial transnational conservation area in the world. It spans 5 countries and a large degree of environmental variability across this region. And we're working specifically in 3 conservation areas, or community conservation conservancies, in Zambia, the Lower West Game Management Area, the Mashi Conservancy in the Zambezi region in Namibia, and the Chobe Enclave in northwestern Botswana. We've been working, over the course of 2 field seasons, conducted household surveys, about 48 household surveys per 5 village areas in each of these 3 conservancy zones, to try to get at some aspects of household land use and household food security in this particular region. As you can see, this is overlaid with mean annual precipitation across a relatively long period of time from the CHIRPS data set. There is a gradient, sort of north to south and east to west, or west to east, in terms of overall amount of precipitation, and certainly this is a highly variable sort of area for precipitation, as it sits right on the boundary of the intertropical convergence zone and its migration. So year to year and even within seasons, we're talking about a very variable environment, which has major impacts on decision making and crop choice and food production in general, which is one of the reasons that we've been drawn to this area to ask these questions. Overlaid on that is that this is, as a game management area, as a conservation area, it has been created to try to facilitate more and easier sort of movement of wildlife across this area, and overlaid on this are these relatively low density but fairly broadly sort of scattered populated places that are coming into contact with that wildlife, that are benefiting in certain ways from tourism, and intersecting with these broader conservation and policy-related institutional changes that have been put in place. So that's the broad context of what we're looking at. So to ask these questions, we're really sort of orienting ourselves within this sort of land systems approach, and focusing primarily on this intersection between land cover and land use that Verburg and many others have described as sort of land function, the provision of goods and services from land uses that are intersecting and interacting with land cover and land cover change. And so we're looking at trying to understand food production and how that relates to households and their decision making within this context. And to do so, we're looking at livelihoods and livelihood strategies and some of the related outcomes within a broader framework of vulnerability that we're characterizing using the concepts of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity that interact to define or to essentially combine to result in household vulnerability. And so digging into this at a little bit more specificity, we're defining household vulnerability here with respect to food insecurity. We're defining exposure with respect to the spatiotemporal sort of nature of the environment, and specifically the characteristics of the land uses in this particular area. And that does include some aspects of climate and climate change. We're defining adaptive capacity with regards to sort of the ability to cope or adapt to system dynamics with respect to food security and household vulnerability. And finally, sensitivity is essentially the degree to which a household is impacted by and benefits or receives outcomes, those provisions from the exposure-related components of the system. And so this model is fit with a structural equation of approach. We're using the structural model that encompasses these latent characteristics that we're assigning to the household. We're treating them as sort of these unmeasurable constructs that we can't directly measure, but that has a measurement model attached to that. And so we have indicators that we are trying to extract from not only the household survey, but also from remotely sensed data to attach to these latent characteristics that are indicators of these latent structures in some cases and covariates of in others. So to talk about, again, you're part of this process as well now. We're sort of giving you the results of our pre-registered sort of conceptual model, the things that we thought would fit as measurements of this model to begin with. And we'll talk a little bit about the constraints and some of the things that we will do from here forward. But the measurements, the indicators for this particular model that we came up with to begin with, starting with household vulnerability, are essentially the number of months that are food insecure from the last year, combined with the number of months of food insecurity from an average year that are asked. And these are essentially questions that are asking, how concerned or how many within each month are days hungry for the particular household. And we combine that with a indexed variable, which is essentially a food index category, an ordinal categorical variable that is a composite of several other types of questions about food preference and reliance on natural resources when being food insecure. For the land use and environmental variables, looking at the arrows pointing to, these are indicator variables, so the things that we're measuring about exposure in this case. So we're looking at essentially the cropped area, so the farm size in general, the number of goats and cattle, and the number of resource types that we asked about in terms of natural resources gathered. And we'll talk a little bit about the implications of this. But then we have three covariates that we think are going to affect exposure as a sort of household structure. And we initially chose these because we think that they're broad proxies for sort of environmental characteristics that might affect exposure. And that includes the rainy season length, so the overall sort of average rainy season length, the distance to floodplain for a particular household, and their sort of nearby area, and essentially the median dry season NDVI, which is a broad proxy for essentially the vegetation conditions that a household may be exposed to on a day-to-day basis. So these are calculated within a 1 kilometer buffer of the household area that the household is located in. And finally, adaptive capacity is representative essentially of these broad livelihood characteristics. So there's a proportion of the income, the household income from welfare sources, the number of healthy household workers, the highest education level of any household member, and two indices that are constructed from another set of composites that are durable goods or durable assets, and a set of questions that are dealing with sort of social connections. So, community meetings attended, participation in food and labor sharing agreements. So we fit this using the structural equation approach, and I don't want to focus too much on these are standardized coefficients fit to it, because again, as sort of the pre-registered theoretical construction of the model, it doesn't fit extremely well. It's close in terms of our fit indices where we want this to be. It's is reasonable, but it's not something that we've put a large degree of statistical confidence in at this point with these particular sets of indices or indicators in the measurement model. And so that is a caveat that I'll sort of point to as a future area to try to look at. Because in this type of modeling framework, we can't really look at this and say that this is the one true model with the one true set of indicators that describes this sort of set of conditions. And there are reasons to believe that we could be drawing arrows in different directions or moving indicators between these to reflect different relationships about household vulnerability. And that's something that we're interested in a broader discussion about. But the strength of this is that we can combine and look at the relative effects of these different latent constructs on household vulnerability with respect to food insecurity. And if in this particular realization of the model, we see that exposure and adaptive capacity are both strongly predictive of this household vulnerability construct, but in different ways and in different sort of pathways through this land function nexus between the land use and the outcomes of that. Now, because, again, we're looking at sort of field size, and sort of the relationship in this particular set of case studies, I wanted to talk about this. Cropped area versus crop yields in this context, clearly has some sort of, log linear relationship. So log transformed, it is negative in this context. For any households that are cropping, that this is sort of the relationship that comes out of that. So it's interesting, in that context, these are all smallholder, mostly. I mean, we're talking about relatively small field sizes anyway. But that this relationship does seem to reflect some of these broader trends. So I want to finish up by just saying that this vulnerability framework seems to have some validity in this context as we've specified it, but that there are some reasons to believe that further development of the modeling and the measurements is going to be necessary. Thank you.
Session. And our last speaker is Maarten J.
Can I put it in there? Yep. Yeah. So hello everybody, my name is Maarten J. and I'm from the ETH Zurich. And I won't be talking about farm size, but about a very related topic, and that is the amount of intensive and extensive agriculture there is in an agricultural region. So every farmer basically has the choice to intensify or extensify their production. And this choice is dependent on many external drivers to the system. We have, for instance, agricultural direct payments that the farmer might receive, prices for agricultural produce, or the climate. And so changes in each of these drivers can actually increase or decrease the amount of extensive agriculture. But because it's a very complex socio-ecological system, as you will know, most agricultural regions, we ask ourselves the question how we can predict intensification or extensification and the changes in these external drivers in such a complex socio-ecological system. And what we actually found is that we could do, or that bifurcation diagrams are very useful tools to make these predictions. Bifurcation diagrams are diagrams in which the stable and unstable equilibria in the system are depicted. And don't worry if you don't understand it at the moment, because I'll slowly or quickly go through it and explain to you what bifurcation diagrams are. And then in the next part of the talk, I'll actually explain to you how we reconstructed these diagrams from land use model, an agent-based land use model of an agricultural region. So let's say this is a very simple example of an agricultural region, or this can also be a farm in itself, where the amount of extensive agriculture can actually range between 0 and 1,000 hectares. So this is our system state. And let's say that the system state, or changes to the system state, are driven by two functions, very simple functions. A cost function, which is just a linear one, and an income function, which has a bit of an S shape. And so each of them produce basically cash flows. In this diagram, in such a diagram, you can see that there is 3 points where costs equal the income, and this is what we call the equilibria. So all else being equal, you can assume if a farmer gets as much as it costs, he will not change anything on his farm or in a region. So these are the equilibria. But the interesting parts are actually between the equilibria, because, of course, if the income is higher than the costs, what will a farmer do? Probably increase the area of extensive agriculture. However, if the costs, for instance, in this part are higher than the income, he or she will probably decrease the area of extensive agriculture. And so if we put these arrows in the plot, you can see that there is actually 2 points to which all the extensive agriculture will over time evolve, and these are these two stable equilibria, so there will be a movement towards these points. And there's one unstable equilibrium. Only when it's exactly at this situation will this amount of agriculture actually stay there. But as soon as there's a small deviation, it will either evolve to this stable equilibrium or this stable equilibrium. So this is a very simple example of how these equilibria work. And this only works in a system where everything else is stable. But what now if we make, for instance, the income function reacting to external drivers? In this case, let's say the market prices. The only thing I did here is all the time the cost function is exactly the same, but the income function just slightly shifts to the left every time. That's the only thing I did in these graphs. But what we can see if we look actually at the equilibria in this system is we see quite an interesting pattern evolving. Because here again you have these one stable equilibria, and here you have in the middle these two stable and one unstable equilibria. And now if we plot the equilibria against the market price increases, here are the market price increases, so these are just hypothetical numbers. So if you plot, we see this nice S-curve. So this is the system state, and these are the equilibria. And if we do this for very many levels of market prices, we get what we call a bifurcation diagram. This basically shows the equilibria in our system, or the equilibria states, so the amount of extensive agriculture to which the system will evolve over time. And these are actually very interesting and handy diagrams, because for every point for every amount of extensive agriculture, we can always predict in which direction it will be evolving over time for a certain market price. Here there will always be a decrease. It will decrease until this equilibrium is reached. Here there will always be an increase until that equilibrium is reached. And here it depends on the starting point of the system. If it's, for instance, 200 hectares, it will probably decrease. Or if it's 600 hectares, it will probably increase. So in theory, with this very simple example, these diagrams are fairly easy to explain and understand. But in practice, they are super difficult to find these equilibria in real systems. So what we actually try to do is find these equilibria in the outputs of agent-based models. And we have this agent-based model of an agricultural region here in Switzerland. This is just a bit south of Bern. Here is Bern, here's the region. And this agent-based model, in this region, it's in a mountainous region. There's mainly agriculture and tourism, the main sources of income. And this agent-based model of the region has been developed over very many years and has been used in several studies now. And it simulates the land use changes in mountain landscapes based on land use decisions of individual farmers under a range of socio-economic, political, and ecological constraints. And so the system state that we were interested in was, again, this area of intensive and extensive agriculture, as was also in my previous example. The external driver that we varied was the amount of agricultural direct payments. We also looked at other things, but here I'm only explaining or showing the results of this driver. And we ran the simulation model 350 times with different initial land use configurations and different values of these direct payments for 10-year periods every time, this agent-based model. And all the other input settings were randomized so that the effect that we found was really a result of these changes we made to the land use configuration and the direct payments. And then finally, we analyzed the results of the output by assessing the rate and direction of change in intensive and extensive agriculture with linear regression. And I would immediately like to jump to some of the results that we found. So here again, if we have my system state, which is the area of intensive agriculture and extensive agriculture, and here we have these level of direct payments. And important to show is that 1 is always the current level of direct payments. So everything above 1 is an increase of direct payments. Everything below 1 is a decrease of direct payments. And what we can see here for intensive agriculture is that there's actually a decrease at the lower part of the graph and an increase at the higher part of the top part of the graph. And these arrows represent the changes in a 10-year period. So logically, between these two areas, there is an unstable equilibrium because it's moving away from this equilibrium. Here we see the opposite for extensive agriculture. We see a decrease at the top and an increase at the bottom. So along the same lines, here there is probably a stable equilibrium emerging. And we actually quantified these equilibria with making use of support vector machine classifications, which basically divide these areas of positive growth and negative growth in our graphs. And the divider line between these two areas are basically our equilibria, which I colored blue for stable equilibria and orange for unstable equilibria. And these are basically our bifurcation diagrams that we reconstructed from the output of our agent-based model. So what can we learn from these bifurcation diagrams? For instance, one of the things we can actually find is that a minimum amount of direct payments is necessary for extensification to take place. As you can see here, up to this amount of direct payments, there will always be an increase of intensive agriculture. This is the plot for intensive agriculture. And here there will always be a decrease, although I don't know how significant this little bend is, but the model says there will be a decrease here. So this is one of the things we can find with these results. Another thing we can look at is, for instance, let's say we have a system, or in our region there's 3,000 hectares of extensive agriculture. If we do nothing at current rates of direct payments, this extensive agriculture will slowly decrease until this stable equilibrium is reached. So it will somehow approximately like 1,800 hectares. However, if we want to keep the current amount of extensive agriculture, we have to increase the direct payments, and that is approximately by 1.5 times the current rates. Only then will the system slowly evolve until it kind of stabilizes at this stable equilibrium point. So these are two examples that you can actually do with these kinds of bifurcation diagrams. And there's other things that you can get out of them, but I hope I convinced you that they are actually quite handy, and they can be made from any agent-based model or also non-agent-based model. You can basically create these kinds of diagrams. And just to conclude, so with the presented approach, we can actually predict how external system drivers affect the rate and direction of growth of intensive and extensive agriculture. But you can also have other system states if you're interested. You could look at farm size, for instance. The bifurcation diagrams are actually handy meta-models of a socio-ecological system with which the tipping points and the trade-offs can be estimated. And the results, of course, there's also a more applied focus of this. Yes, the results can actually help to increase the levels of extensive agriculture in the study region that we have by changing these direct payments or the other system drivers that we looked at. So if you're interested in more details about this study, actually yesterday it was published, so you can find this publication online. And this is a picture of the study region, so it's quite pretty, as you can see. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah.
I got one question of my friend.
Whoa.
I think you were first.
I probably missed that, but how did you get to this initial model,
So the model at the beginning, this one basically, these models. So this was basically a hypothetical explanation of how these equilibria, how you can find these equilibria in a system. So this is not based on real data. I actually sat behind the computer and thought this would be a nice cost function. But in a real agent-based model, there's many more functions like these included. But in the agent-based model we used, there's maybe 50 different functions on how different things interact with each other. So to explain that to you here, it would become a pretty messy diagram. So I actually tried to minimize my system to 2 functions, but they are made up basically. They are based on empirical data and has been previously published. So this ALUAM AB is actually used in quite many studies and has been developed from surveys and several other data sources, yes. Yeah.
I would like to invite all speakers now who will start off with the discussion, which will then be open to the...
Shall I keep this on?
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably just
Quickly take a sip. Yeah, let's go. Where is it?
I guess just a minute.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Let it circulate. Sorry.
Maybe you should take it since you're in the center. Sure.
All right, so I think I'm going to start us off here just first by thanking the presenters for really bringing a lot of insight and additional detail into a question that people have been thinking about forever. I mean, you talk about the enclosure in the 16th century, people deciding politically what size farms should be, who should have access to this land, what is the land for, and who should benefit from its use. So these are centuries-old questions, and I think that they're not going to be resolved one model at a time, but we can increasingly get insight into different places and different contexts and provide that insight to policymakers who have actually real interest in trying to produce the kinds of food and ecosystem services and sort of social and vulnerability protections that land can often provide. So I wanted just to start off by asking just a couple questions to the panel as a whole, and then we'll, I think, go to the audience to start to have more of a debate. But one of my questions is just how you go about in your research demystifying this idea of farm size as a natural construct, as something that appears in the landscape, and then we want to study the outcomes of that, versus understanding farm size itself as an outcome of other social and ecological processes. So that's probably a first question. Do you perceive in your work farm size as an outcome or as a driver? I've asked Vinny this question before, so this is unfair.
For my specific context, I mean, I could talk for hours about this, but it's a very conflictual context where you can see really this pressure from large landowners, and also it affects the strategy of smallholders. And I think it's a very crucial question to include also in our analysis, even if we're doing like very statistical models, to include also at some degree this kind of history that completely defines the type of land ownership and the size of each farms, and how also it can be a very important question of negotiation between like smallholders and large official landowners. And for instance, it happened I was in contact with several smallholders who were limited in their activities because the only way for them to get some legal recognition was to downsize the size of their farms and to get then an official agreement with the landowners. So I think including this conflict, these dynamics of land tenure and land size are very important.
Right. Negotiation sometimes at the point of a gun, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Anybody else? Farm size as a driver or an outcome of these socio-ecological relationships that we're looking at?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's both a driver and an outcome. And I think that maybe more importantly, too, it's just one aspect of a farming system, right? And all these different outcomes that we're looking at, they all have their unique drivers. And if we only look at farm size, too, then we're going to miss out on other key vulnerabilities of farmers, right? And so I just think that the farm size discussion should also move into a little bit more to capture these types of things. And I think the types of data that we're playing with can start to actually play with these in really neat ways. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, let's move to the vulnerability question. So a couple of you talked about poverty and its relationship with vulnerability or exposure and those sorts of things. So to what extent can we bring that larger social context of poverty and social welfare feelings or floors into this question about making land management decisions? So to what extent, if we think about land reform, so governments use the idea of land redistribution as a poverty alleviation measure, as a political containment measure, as a ecosystem services protection measure, if we talk about land distribution into conservation districts, for example. To what extent do you think that land redistribution is an effective poverty alleviation measure?
Well, I'm we haven't really addressed sort of redistribution in any kind of way. But I think one of the huge challenges is that we end up in trying to assess something like, well, how much area undercropping does a household maintain? And that's constrained a lot by both the sort of institutional and the tenure-related sort of aspects, especially in a system like ours, to the degree that the households are sort of managing one labor against just the needs for food in that particular context in a way that I think is really very often they're not making that many choices about how much to farm. They're doing it as much as they can, and I think that's something that's you can look at as sort of correlated with lots of those household level variables.
So to what extent are these actually choices that farmers are making versus constraints that they're faced with their political and ecological capabilities and endowments?
Under the umbrella of much larger policy and institutional kinds of decisions that might be impacting that.
So maybe in the Chaco context, should land be redistributed?
Yeah, I think even before we talk about redistribution, I think I would set in the priority first securing land rights of smallholders and indigenous communities, and it's really something that is lacking. It's less than 20% of our sample who had land tenure security, opposed to 80% who are always in the threat of being evicted. And as you say, there can be also physical violence involved. So I think, even before talking really about redistribution, which is also a huge issue, especially if we look more at indigenous communities in this context, but securing the land rights of smallholders, of indigenous communities, it's really a large, big priority.
So that might be a half-earth proposal. Secure the land rights of diversified, small-scale, indigenous and small-scale farmers. Might get us to half-earth. Imagine that. I don't know how many people were in the half-earth proposal.
Well, I just can look at it from like the Swiss context, where I think it's not so fair to talk about poverty among the farmers, but there is no poverty purely because of the subsidies that the farmers get. Huge amounts of direct payments. If they wouldn't get that, all of them would go out of business. I think really all of them. And next to that, most of the farmers, the vast majority, at least in these kinds of regions, they are part-time farmers. They are having a job on the side. So from that perspective, I think maybe it's not such a good thing to say in Switzerland, but it might be good that there would be some redistribution of the land to maybe larger farms that are perhaps more profitable on themselves, like can scale up the production, because it's always a question, like, do we want to keep the whole system alive with subsidies? Like, is that the thing we want here finally?
So what are people paying for with the subsidies? They're paying for the preservation of a landscape, or
and indirectly also for like if I buy a packet of milk in the supermarket, it costs me €1, but indirectly the taxpayer is paying for this milk. I mean, this is the whole system as it is here at the moment. But of course, this is a highly controversial topic in Switzerland, but also in Europe. I mean, all of the
all
agriculture.
over the world, too. This gets back to the land function question. What is the land for? Who is responsible for delivering those functions, and then who gets the benefits from them? So these are the really important questions around farm size and farm access and farmland security that really, I think, this research is making some good efforts towards. I'll ask one more, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. And that has I'm a sociologist, and I'm a sort of ethnographer, interviewer, and I've come to this conference really interested in the science here and what kind of science is needed to address these really important questions of food security and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I was really interested to see that a lot of you are really doing mixed method research, where you're talking to people on the ground and you're sort of ground truthing these models and these other kinds of information. And one of the things I was thinking about, I don't know how many of you have ever filled out an agricultural census, but they're very long and they're full of very detailed questions that many farmers across the world actually have difficulty answering. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the validity of some of these more large and sort of remotely accessed or census-based data as compared to what you're finding when you're talking to people on the ground. So maybe just from your own projects, how have you sort of dealt with the epistemological conflicts between your different kinds of data?
Yeah, I mean, I think my project is less to the ground than other people's projects, but I do have a background doing household surveys. And, I mean, some of them you ask people for dietary ones, right? What did you eat last month, right? That's really difficult. Or how much did you grow? And these things are really hard. And in all of our data harmonization work across different surveys, we try to do checks as best as we can. You add up things, and some things just don't add up. And so I think that there's different conversations I've had with other people in this room, too, where if we can come up with a set of ways that we can actually interrogate the surveys, validity, and these different responses, too, beyond just simple adding ups. But yeah, so I think that's just one bigger issue when using these types of surveys. But maybe connecting to the ground, you guys have better ideas.
Maybe I wanted to ask you also about the validity of the statistic that you use, because then you use this national aggregated statistics. What do you think about this?
The national aggregated statistics? Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that we do, it was trying to actually look at statistics that were directly linked to the particular size farm. So a lot of the other types of surveys were just saying, we know that this country has this amount of crop production, and they have this amount of smallholders, and so then they overlay. But what we were doing was we were only using surveys that directly linked the two. And doing that, I think, gets around a little bit of the aggregation itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our work, it certainly was quickly, sort of challenging with regards to the ways in which you ask questions about not just food security, but even just the cropping itself. Are people going to be answering in bags of maize, or are they going to be answering in terms of tins or kgs, or and so those just methodological concerns of how you ask questions, and then end up with dealing with the noise in the data. At the end is there are many decisions all along the way that can come back to bite you once you finally get to analyzing the data. And I one of the I think in the best case, right, you do have a very well documented set of both questions and the sort of diversity of the answers and how you dealt with processing that data. But that's all through that lens of, are you asking the right questions in a way that people will answer, in that, it's not ethnographic research. You have a very limited amount of time in a household speaking to one particular person, or a small group usually. Are you getting answers that really address the questions that you're interested in? I think that's always a challenge.
Good. Yeah, so audience. Yeah.
Can I ask a question to Maarten? I would like to ask you, well, I'm not very much into modeling, but if I understand well, what you're doing is basically predicting the behavior of farmers, whether they will extensify or intensify these things. So I would like to know if you plan, or you have done it already, or you plan to do a devolution of results with those farmers. Are you discussing with them how you predicted their behavior? It is just a curiosity question.
I must admit that I personally mainly took the model that has been developed in the past and worked with the model. But what I know is that this model has really been built up, this particular Asian-based model has been built up with the local farmers also, surveys and census data, and I believe there has been a feedback of these results towards the farmers again. I'm not sure how they reacted to that, to be honest. I would like to know there's nobody here that actually was involved with the actual programming of this model, I believe, but this would have been a very interesting thing to see, because I could imagine they are very skeptical towards this kind of work, and therefore I'm not sure if it's more of value to us as scientists, so that we understand these processes of how direct payments or climate change or other things would change the landscape, or oppose that, or whether these are really, such a model is really valuable tool to inform farmers. I'm still in doubt. I know there is a big trend that we have to have like participatory modeling and feed back the results of these models to the people, but mainly there's skepticism. How do you know what I'm going to do next year? I mean, this is the, that's it, yeah.
Well, I know that many in this room might hate economy, but I will throw three economic perspectives on the overall presentation here. One, agriculture economists have known this relationship between yield and farm size since the 60s. So what have we learned from agriculture economics? That's the first one. Second one is, have you ever thought about looking at the Venables, Ojeda, and Krugman? They wrote a book on spatial economy where they explain urban size, plot size by distance. But there's a very interesting analogy to what you guys have. Have you thought about applying that theory into the perspective of rural land use? The third one is specifically Maarten. How do you reconcile your bifurcation with microeconomic theory?
Okay. Well, I can tackle the first question on yields and farm size. And yeah, it's been something that economists have been seeing since, or documenting since the 60s, seeing since the 1930s actually in Russia. And all of the studies that I had were agricultural economic studies in that yield bit. A couple things that jumped out though is that nobody really had consensus on why. Why do smaller farms have higher yields? There's tons of different theories over the years. Three main ones was on different land quality, was on the use of family labor on smaller farms, increased productivity, and then also different imperfect markets as well. Input markets, labor markets, land markets, credit as well. There's been a whole slew. And so I didn't go into the details here, but when we looked at each of those studies and did our meta-regressions, we actually started testing the hypotheses. Did that author control for labor, family labor? Did they control for land heterogeneity or not? And I didn't go into that. And the only one that actually signals really loud to us is that once people controlled for family labor, that relationship became null. And so it signals to me that the ag economists were right in that. But a big thing that I found in looking at the literature is most of these studies only looked at farms maybe up till 20, maybe 50 hectares tops, but way smaller typically. And so in that community, I would urge them to look at much larger farms, because if we're looking into the future and we're looking at really large areas, then we're going to have to see how precision agriculture comes into that as well. Yeah.
Maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions all at once and then let the speakers each have a final word. So, in the front, yeah. Go ahead.
In complex systems thinking, or at least in this complex socio-ecological system thinking, the theory is basically that these equilibria are sort of a given in the system, or they are kind of fixed. It's not exactly like that, but so if there is a crisis, yes, that can happen. And so two things can happen in the crisis situation. For instance, let's say we have a system that is at this point, or let's say current levels of market prices, or no, 1% market price increase and 600 hectares. If there is a crisis, or at the current rate, the system will slowly be evolving towards this stable equilibrium. But let's say there's a crisis that 40% or 50% of all the extensive agriculture vanishes. But again, from this figure, you can get a lot of information, because that would bring the system into this state, which in one eye drop you can actually find out that this would bring it into another basin of attraction, as they call it. This is a basin of attraction. It would slowly evolve towards this stable equilibrium. The same can happen, for instance, if there is a sudden decrease in market prices. You can say there's a huge drop in market prices, well, huge 1% drop in market prices, which would bring the system in this point in time. Here we had a growing system, or a growing increase agriculture. Here you had a decreasing agriculture. So actually these graphs are exactly used for these kinds of shocks and changes to the system, to understand them.
Yeah.
We are over, already 5 minutes over time, but we take one last question. Short question, short answer.
Very short. So I wanted to know your perspective on the future of these patterns that you're seeing. So right now you see that smallholder farms are higher yielding, but like you said, a lot of that is maybe because of the availability of land and acres.
Right.
But we know that in a lot of smallholder systems, families are starting to face tougher livelihoods, they're shortages, they're running into this.
Yeah. It seems like you kind of answered your own question. So thanks. I think you're right on. And it actually gets back at your original question a bit ago, where I've been reading a lot of literature on just these countries that have policy rhetoric for land consolidation, or sometimes land reform. But the land consolidation ones are always interesting to me. And so much of the rhetoric is saying, well, we want to make our farms bigger so that we can have more productivity or resource use efficiency. But if a country's not economically ready to absorb that farming population too, then it might not be that great of a food security situation for those farmers who are going off farm. So in the case that you're mentioning, where these family farms are diversifying, they're probably doing that because they have opportunities. And so I would imagine in that particular situation, that might be a good situation. But if there's policies pushing them off the land, then it might just be too early for some of these countries as well.